Morning all and good evening. Welcome to the 32nd C.A. Sheppard Memorial Lecture. The C.A. Sheppard Memorial Lecture is the prestigious annual academic event of the Department of English, instituted to commemorate the happy memory of the legendary teacher of the department, the late Professor C.A. Sheppard. This lecture was previously delivered by eminent scholars like Professor Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, Arjun Appadurai, Akhil Bilgrami, Richard Schechner, Toril Moy, David Bromwich, Laura Mulvey, to name a few. This year, we are so privileged to have Professor Homi K. Bhabha as a speaker. It's no wonder that the memory of Professor C.A. Sheppard has attracted so many prominent scholars because he himself was a scholar par excellence in his time and in his own way.
He was also one of the best teachers of English language and literature in South India. He was also an ardent lover of the same. He could observe the soul and spirit and carry them to his bones. He was an embodiment of human kindness and compassion that the study of literature and humanities aimed to nurture. He could instill the same in his students and colleagues. He wanted to love them till the end and their land, so he refused to leave them and go to Australia and settle there as he was of an Australian origin. He was in the sense of a true cosmopolitan and a great humanist. Let's use this occasion to pay our tribute to this great teacher and lover of literature and humanities.
Well, now, before we begin, let us take a few moments to observe silent prayer. Thank you all. Now, here are just a few instructions that the audience are humbly requested to keep in mind to ensure the smooth functioning of our program. All the questions that are intended for the interactive session should be posted in the chat box, addressing it to everyone. A feedback form will be posted at the end of this session in both Zoom and YouTube. Participants are requested to fill in the form accurately to ensure that they obtain their e-certificates. It will be issued within 24 hours. Participants are also humbly requested not to introduce yourself in the chat box. Well, these were just a few things to keep in mind. Thank you for patiently listening. Over to you, Nina.
Thank you, Dan. Next, I would like to call upon Dr. Jacob Matthew, the principal of St. Berchmans College, for the welcome address. Sir, you can take over.
Thank you, Nina. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Dear Professor Homi K. Bhabha, Reverend Dr. Thomas Padiyat, our manager, other dignitaries, vice principals, Professor P.J. Thomas, head of the Department of English, former teachers, invited guests, dear teachers and students. Good evening to all. I feel delighted to welcome everyone to the 32nd C.A. Sheppard Memorial Lecture, organized by the Department of English, St. Berchmans College, Changanassery. It is indeed a happy moment for the Department of English and the college. This memorial lecture organized by the English department helps us to fondly recall the memory of a doyen of this college, Professor Colin Anthony Stuart Sheppard. Professor Sheppard joined St. Berchmans as a lecturer in English in 1943 and became the head of the department in 1949. He was an inspiring teacher and helped others shape themselves as good teachers. He was a delightful speaker, a writer, and a director. Lectures in grammar and idiom, towards better English and a sense of English are some of his important works. He directed Shakespeare's play and helped many to become good actors. An erudite and inspiring teacher, Professor Sheppard was a noble and dignified human being as well, whose memory is ever fresh in the hearts of his students and colleagues. Professor Homi K. Bhabha will deliver the 32nd C.A. Sheppard Memorial Lecture on Humanities in the time of the pandemic. It is my proud privilege to welcome Professor Homi K. Bhabha, Annie F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University, formerly to this college. I am sure Professor P.J. Thomas will introduce this influential theorist of post-colonial culture to the audience who are virtually connected far and wide. Let me take this opportunity to thank Professor Bhabha for his generosity in accepting our invitation and giving this memorial lecture. On behalf of the Berchmans community, I welcome you to this program, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Reverend Dr. Thomas Paddiett, our manager, doesn't need a formal introduction at all. He is with us in all our endeavors and motivates us to do the task with utmost sincerity and commitment. Dear Father, I wholeheartedly welcome you to this program. I cordially welcome our Vice Principals, Dr. Benny Matthew, Reverend Father Reggie P. Kurian, Reverend Father Jose George, our former professors, heads of the departments, teachers from the neighboring colleges, and those who are virtually connected to this function. I would also like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude towards all who sincerely contributed this event. My special thanks to the coordinator of this event, none other than the head of the Department of English, Professor P.J. Thomas. Last but not the least, I wholeheartedly welcome my dear students to this function. Welcoming you all once again, I remain. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We welcome you too to this program. Now, I would like to invite the head of the Department of English, Professor P.J. Thomas, to introduce the speaker for the evening. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dan. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you are.
All right. Our dear principal, manager, vice principals, most distinguished participants. In fact, I have a very huge task in my hands, that is to introduce Professor Homi Bhabha. Well, there are so many constraints here of time, and we are on air. So, and moreover, there is a risk to the speaker when the speaker is introduced by somebody else, and therefore I would try my best not to actually have any risk for Homi Bhabha, that I would be very brief, because the disadvantage is that the introduction goes before the actual talk. As it has been already mentioned, Professor Bhabha is currently the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities and Senior Advisor on the Humanities to the President and Provost at Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Formerly, he was the Director of the Mahindra Humanities Center there, which he himself helped to establish. He has also taught at many universities like Oxford, Sussex, Warwick, London, and Chicago, to name a few. He got educated at universities of Mumbai and Oxford, and he wrote his doctoral thesis on V.S. Naipaul at Christ Church, Oxford. Some of his selected works include The Location of Culture, a Routledge classic in 2004, Still Life in 2004, Adagio in 2004, Framing Fanon in 2005, The Black Salmon and the Dark Princess in 2002, or 2009, I'm sorry, and Global Memory in 2009, Elusive Objects in 2009, Our Neighbors, Ourselves in 2011, Beyond Photography in 2011. His forthcoming books include On Art, A Global Measure, The Right to Narrate. Professor Bhabha, as you all know, has been a profoundly original voice in the study of colonial, post-colonial, and globalized culture. He has developed and explored key concepts like hybridity, mimicry, and ambivalence in his theoretical essays. His theory of third space is built on these ideas. These ideas also inspired works in other fields like management studies, art theory, architecture, human rights, development studies, theology, and many other unexpected fields. Thus, his ideas and concepts are extremely relevant to analyze contemporary developments, which are extremely global and identitarian at the same time. He was influenced by Edward Said, Michel Foucault, Fanon, Derrida, Lacan, Walter Benjamin, Salman Rushdie, Toni Morrison, V.S. Naipaul, and many others. In 2012, he received the Padma Bhushan Award in the field of literature and education from the Government of India. And in 2015, Professor Bhabha won the prestigious Alexander von Humboldt Research Award from Research Center for Literary and Culture at Berlin. So I know this is a very short introduction. So with these introductory remarks now, I invite Professor Bhabha for the 32nd Sheppard Memorial Lecture. That's going to be an interactive session. Now welcome to Professor Bhabha for a few remarks to begin with.
Thank you very much, my dear hosts. I want to thank Dan, I want to thank Nina, Professor Jacob Matthews, Professor PJ Thomas, who has been a remarkably sustained and hospitable figure who initiated the invitation. I want to thank you all for your generosity. I want to thank you all for your interest. As you see me here sitting in my study in Cambridge, Massachusetts, trying to write and wrestle with my ideas, you never feel you're going to be fortunate enough to have anybody listening to what is in your mind. And it is a great sense of gratification to have people who take you seriously, who read you, who think about what you say, who take the trouble and the patience to interpret what you do. And I have to say that that is a gift. It's a gift you should never expect, but it is a gift. And I thank you very much for demonstrating that generosity and gratitude to me today. I also want to say, dear principal, dear colleagues, dear students, how moving I found the opening ceremony this morning. At a time when people's attention is very short, when tweeting has become a mode of communication, even on the part of misjudged presidents around the world and political leaders, when the attention span due to technology has shrunk, although exponentially the reach has widened, in such circumstances, it is deeply important to nourish the memory of institutions and to keep alive the long histories of those upon whose work the institution depends. So I am deeply honored to hear in my own person honor the memory of C.A. Sheppard, and indeed to commend and admire the Department of English and St. Berchmans College as a whole. So thank you very much for hosting me. And I want everybody in the room to applaud the institutional memory that you have provided us, which is an act not only of tradition, but it is an act of deep gratitude to the past, and it is a way in which the traditions of the past continue to unfold and enrich the present moment. So I'm going to applaud, and I would like everybody to applaud with me. Thank you very much. I suggested that we would have an interactive session because on Zoom, it is very difficult to establish the one-to-one relationship you have with even a very large crowd. However large the crowd, when you're in the presence of the crowd, when you're in the presence of the audience, you feel an energy which it is difficult to generate on Zoom. I'll do my very best. But from that perspective, having Zoomed now number of times over 9 months in different contexts, in different parts of the world, I believe that an interactive conversation works so much better than for me to hold forth for 50 minutes, which of course, on another occasion, I would be very happy to do. So let me start by asking you to question me in any manner and on any subject that is of importance to this audience, and I will do my very best to provide as thoughtful an answer as I can. Before we do that, let me just say that from the American perspective, I see the pandemic and its problems closely related to the George Floyd protests. Therefore, I feel to understand our present moment, we have to understand public health and the epidemiological issues of public health and the way in which minorities generally across the world have suffered more because minorities are essential workers, migrant workers. They carry the burdens on their back. They don't have the security. They don't have the protection. They don't have the access that those who are privileged have. And if you look at this analogically, in terms of the George Floyd protests, certainly in the United States, we find that it is the same political and demographic group, African Americans, Blacks, minorities, who suffer disproportionately from the acts of the police, acts of violence, acts of the state. So I want to suggest that, my dear friends, for years we have talked about global culture. We have talked about global law. We've talked about global financial and economic structures. Today, unfortunately, we are confronted with the global phenomenon of ethno-nationalist, populist leaders almost across the world, although the tide may be turning now. Certainly it is turning slowly in the United States. And when you have such a leadership, it is always the dissidents, the disadvantaged, the marginalized, the minorities who pay the largest price. So today, my dear friends, we are faced with a global political phenomenon, a global form of governance, a global form of injustice, a global form of inequality, and that has been the watermark of the pandemic and the protests. And let us also say, as I conclude my opening remarks, that this notion of protest against state violence, against free speech, this protest has been global. So just as the injustices and inequities of certain governmental structures have been global, we also hear a global response, a global sense of protest. And in the work I'm writing at the moment, I've been thinking about the George Floyd memorials, murals painted on walls across the world, in a sense of identification with George Floyd. Now, to understand these murals, all of which have the portrait of the man, we have to look beyond the image itself. Yes, they all memorialize the murder, the killing of George Floyd with no extenuating circumstances at all in this case. But there is something more than the image. There is the fact that artists in Syria, artists in Berlin, artists in part of India, activist artists, worker artists decided to make these memorials not only in memory of George Floyd, but in recognition of injustice, unfairness, marginalization, discrimination, and violence in their own countries. The face of George Floyd is a symbol, an icon of global injustice. And what is so interesting about this is that an event around an obscure person in Minnesota suddenly embeds itself and is translated across the world. And that is a process which is reminiscent of the concept of translation in the work of the great thinker Walter Benjamin, who says translation takes its impetus not from the life of a previous text or a previous event, but from its afterlife. And it embeds itself like an actual lingual translation in a new language in order to sow a new seed. Of course, the analogy between linguistic translation and then cultural or global translation, as I'm trying to explain it, is a very complicated analogy. But I just want to retain the idea that these George Floyd murals were not all pointing in the direction of the United States or the city of Minnesota, or indeed only pointing at the racist systems within certain police organizations in the US. They were not only pointing at the African-American situation and its long history of deprivation and humiliation. They were pointing at these ideas, these unfortunate circumstances, as they sprout up like seeds, like poisonous plants in the territories of many nation states across the world. With these few words that join together the moral understanding of the victimage of the pandemic and the victims of state violence, I would like to open up to questions that faculty and students would like to put to me. I will make every effort I can to answer them as honestly and as comprehensively as I know, but I hope that these opening words strike a chord with your interests. Thank you very much for inviting me today.
Thank you, Professor Bhabha. Well, I will ask one question for you. Just to get started, as you suggested, the world today is a highly divisive world, highly unequal world. So the first question is like, how can humanities be a medicine, or how can humanities be or give a kind of healing to this scenario that we face now, which actually the pandemic has brought in its worst form?
Well, my dear professor, how does the humanities provide healing is a question that has to be linked to the real impetus or the real moral center of the humanities, which is the work of interpretation. As humanists, we deal with textual materials. We deal with musical scores. We deal with poems. We deal with art. We deal with classical languages. We deal with religious theological ideas. But our work as humanists is largely textually mediated. We are interpreters. And it seems to me that the first job we can do is to interpret, as I tried to do a moment ago, the pandemic. To interpret the pandemic not simply as a problem of a virus, which it is, not simply as a problem in the field of the sciences, as it is, not simply a governmental issue as to how do you produce the vaccine and how do you distribute it, which is a public health issue, but I interpreted it for its moral valence. I suggested that what it has made us aware of is deep social injustices, deep form of humiliation. It has made us aware of the fact that those who are in the front line of keeping our cities, our countries working during the period of pandemic where we are all quarantining ourselves are often those people who have comorbidities, who are poor, who have not had access to medical. So they are really putting themselves out to run the country, not from the White House, not from Rashtrapati Bhavan. They are running the country by running on the roads. And that is a humanistic interpretation, if I may put it, an ethical interpretation of the pandemic that reaches beyond medicine, beyond public health alone, beyond injustice or criminal justice. It reaches down to fundamental issues of inequality, injustice, humiliation, degradation in our society. So let me say, first of all, that by my opening remarks and what I've said now, I want to suggest that it is interpretation, careful reading, that helps us to understand. And that is what we do as humanistic students and humanistic teachers. We enter the field of interpretation. We are not, in that sense, simply creative writers, which is very important. We are not dancers who are also interpreters, but we interpret texts that have given to us. Now, interpretation, I want to suggest, is not simply a knowledge-based activity. It's not simply a philological activity. Interpretation is an ethical activity. Why do I say that? Let me give you two reasons. We teach ourselves as humanists, we teach our students as humanists. Those of us who are public intellectuals teach our audiences or speak to our audiences in the voice of a humanist when we say that interpretation, in order to be valuable, has to in itself have a sense of fairness. You cannot build an argument on misinformation. You cannot build an argument on misinterpretation because you want to argue a certain position or hold to a certain ideology. Interpretation in the humanistic tradition depends on being a lively sense of argumentation, a lively sense of conversation within the university, in the media. But that conversation has to be based on the principle of alterity, not similarity. I.e., when I enter into a serious interpretational dialogue with a text or a person, I have to try and put myself in the place of that person. I have to have that dialogical relationship. And it's not therefore that by putting myself in the place of that person, I have to accept what they say. I do not have to absorb it if I object to it. But what I do have to do is to look back at myself from that person's perspective in order to further my own understanding of where my values, where my principles, and where my ambitions, my desires, my missions come from. That's why I say interpretation is an ethical activity of alterity. It is not simply about consensus. It is not simply about similarity. It is an earnest and sometimes agonizing relationship with that which is different from ourselves. And we have to reflect on that, and we have to build our arguments on that. That's my first issue. The issue of the humanities as alterity. Second issue, as humanists, related to what I have just said, which relates, of course, to democratic discourse, which has to assume that there are different sides to a problem. We don't agree with it, but we have to identify with them. We have to recognize it. So what I'm saying about the ethics of interpretation is absolutely fundamental to the ethics of democracy. And without it, you get proto-fascistic or fascistic notions of dogma imposed on whole continents. You get fear-mongering, you get conspiracy theories if you don't listen to the other. And therefore, my second point is interpretation is a profound instrument of democratic transformation. And my third and final point is that if we think about interpretation ethically, we think about interpretation as central to democratic discourse, and these are the great teachings of the humanities, then the third and final point is that as humanists, we don't simply build models like we do in the sciences, or we do in the social sciences, or we do in economics. We build mathematical models. Very important. I'm not decrying their importance. But there is a distinction. We don't build models, we build communities. A community like this one, it's in Berchmans College, the one that I'm involved in at the moment. So those are the three issues I want to put on the table as part of the contribution that the humanities can make, not only in relation to the pandemic, but I've taken it from the pandemic and the question of race and injustice. I've taken it to the question of the classroom and interpretation. I've taken it to the ethics of cultural exchange. I've taken it to the politics of democracy, and finally, to the building of community. Therefore, my dear Professor Thomas, I would like to say that the role of the humanities is not only the role of, it's not only the role of healing, it is also the role of engagement, the role of a kind of rational community building, the role of an ethical activism. And sometimes, before you heal, you have to see what the diagnosis is. How deep is the wound? How serious is the disease? So the humanities is not only about healing, it is also about diagnostic interpretational practices. Does that answer your question, Professor Thomas?
Yes, definitely. And can I ask a sub-question also?
Please.
In that case, Professor Bhabha is always known as the theory man, and there are many students and faculty here who pursue theory here. So, in what sense, critical theory or theory in particular has helped in this interpretation, or by theory being, say, overtly political, did that give a kind of disadvantage to this interpretation? Well, I have in mind this whole debate about whether theory is disadvantageous to literature. Now, I have in mind a book by Stanley Fish, Professional Correctness, Literary Studies, and Political Change and Political Change. It's an old debate, but still, we'd like to hear from you in what sense theory has helped in this sort of ethical interpretation.
So I think this takes us to a significant question, which is, what is theory? Now, in the time I have, I will not be able to give you a full answer, but I hope to at least give you a helpful answer. And it is my desire to have and enact in this meeting of ours today, in this Sheppard Memorial Lecture, the use of theory not only as my demagoguery. I want to hear from the audience, because I believe the theory is a two-way process. So please forgive me. I don't want to go on and on like a megaphone. Please stop me. But I do want to say that one of the fundamental ideas of theory is the possibility of exchange, the exchange between concept and principle and practice. Now, I do not believe that theoretical ideas need to be proved to be right or wrong in terms of practical analyses, not at all. But I believe that theory is like an armature. It's like a structure. It is like a structure which you climb, posing framework issues or large framework questions about history, about literature, about philosophy, politics, ethics. It's like a framework. And you climb that scaffolding. And while you're climbing the scaffolding, you examine the structure of the world at the same time. Just like, let me give you a metaphor, the scaffold. You want to, theory is very much about renewing and transforming ideas that we inherit without throwing them away. We don't throw them away by saying this is old-fashioned. Not at all. You brought my friend Stanley Fish's text in our discussion now. These were text ideas written a while ago. So theory is as much about invention as it is about renewal. And the way we do that is we put a scaffold and we look at an old building and we take a structural analysis of it and we repair some parts of it and we prop up others by putting iron bars behind it. But mainly what we are doing is seeing the viability of the structure and how it can be repurposed, remediated, to use the new technology, the new word, vocabulary of technology. How can it be remediated to become meaningful to us? So that people think about theory very much in terms of some airy-fairy level of professorial discussion of complicated philosophical ideas. No, my dear friends, I feel theory is reinvention, remediation, translation. It is climbing up the scaffold, using the issues and problems that face us in the present, creating that scaffold from our own times, because we have no other alternatives, to look at the past, look at the future. How do I restructure this edifice? That, to me, is the work of theory. And I feel this kind of answer is much more useful, in my view, for this audience than for me to start giving a lecture on Foucault or a lecture on Lacan or a lecture on post-colonialism. I like to always think the problem again from the perspective in which I'm asked it. I don't like to depend on either my own theories or on other theories. I want to confront the issue as you put it to me, which is one of the great advantages of having a conversation of this kind, so that everybody's voice can be heard and everybody's problem can be addressed without throwing at you obscure references which you may not have access to immediately. I hope you agree with that. As a theorist, I have to be able to speak to you. If I cannot speak to you, I might as well lock myself up in the study, immediately stop the Sheppard lecture and start writing the next paragraph. Aisa nahi chalega.
Yes, so we have collected a number of questions from the participants. There is one participant, Sumati. I'll read that question for you. It's about the management of pandemic. How do political ideological agendas get played upon behind the facade of pandemic management mechanisms?
So who has asked this question?
It's Sumati. I hope she's in the audience. I don't know, but she must be here.
Well, my dear Sumati, you should be an investigative journalist because you know exactly how to ask the important question to which you know the answer even better than I do. I applaud you. Of course, the pandemic, let me be clear. The pandemic is a real event. The pandemic has killed millions of people. Am I not right? Across the world, it's now, the figures are in the millions. Am I not right about this? The pandemic has killed over 300,000 people in the United States. When President Trump told us that it's like a miracle, it'll disappear last April. He said, you know, as soon as the warm weather comes, it'll go. President Bolsonaro in Brazil, another one of the cronies of Trump, another one of these great ethno-nationalist leaders of ours said, oh, the pandemic is a little flu. Don't worry about it. It's just a little flu. And then when President Trump got it and got medicines that hardly anyone else could afford, he said, look, the pandemic hasn't, look, I'm fine, I'm here, I've been born again. I use these instances to show you that A, the pandemic has been used by our leaders across the world. You can speak best for your own, to actually reinforce their power. The pandemic has been used to create confusion, fear, and anxiety. In the United States, by denying scientific advice, by creating a public madness in this country where people now see the wearing of masks as a political issue. Please, the wearing of masks, can you imagine, is seen as a political issue. So the not wearing a mask is seen as a political sense of daring. It's seen as part of a red-blooded, genuine American power. You must have heard that during the siege on the Capitol, when the various politicians were locked in a room, the worst conditions for spreading COVID, and a member of the Democratic Party tried to hand out masks, several Republicans said, horror, I will not wear a mask, therefore endangering the lives of themselves and others. What, my dear friends, could be more visibly an act of political gerrymandering of a health issue? The attack on science across the world, our great leaders who also see themselves as great gurus, putting themselves in places of religious worship, thinking that they will in some ways beat back the demon of the disease. Of course, it doesn't happen. So I think that there is a way in which the myth of political power has embraced the pandemic to misguide people, at least in the United States, who have suffered, businesses that have not been able to sustain themselves, economic foundations of society which have suffered, medical services which are overburdened to the point of almost extinction, people's lives in danger. Of course, the disease is no respecter of persons and places, but the way in which the disease is used politically, ideologically, is profoundly a matter of political and social values. And I think that that is enough of a illustration of the way in which can be used. Now, I was talking to one of my graduate students yesterday who happens to be in Morocco, and apparently in Morocco, restrictions on travel are being used also with a certain notion of political surveillance. So my dear friend Sumati, I hope that that gives you enough information about the uses of the pandemic for the purposes of governments.
Thank you. I will read out one more question, which I have already with me, then I will open up it for some live interactions. And this is from Soham Mukherjee. I guess he must be here in the audience. It is about Eastern European countries. In the past, they did not accept their post-colonial status. They said they were not post-colonial, though they went through the Soviet imperialism, maybe due to their white Eurocentric culture. But now, with the coming of the pandemic, they also started showing certain symptoms and problems of the colonies. So she's asking, can we reconsider these countries, Eastern European and Balkan countries, as post-colonial?
Let me say that this is an important question, but it is too wide and too vague for me to take up in any detail now. I think the notion behind this question is the effect of the Soviet Union on its subordinate, what we call second world countries, and how they have fared post the breakup of the Soviet Union. And I don't think one can generalize this issue. Polish questions are different from the questions in Czechoslovakia. But my own experience is of how a kind of post-colonial analytic and cultural situation develops in a country where the term the post-colonial is relevant. My own experience of this has been in Germany, where I have many links. I have been there, and I've worked them at the Humboldt event is one. I have the Free University in Berlin honored me by making me giving me an honorary doctorate, an honorary degree. So I know the German situation. And let me just say that in the German situation, I discovered early on when I started visiting that there was a kind of post-colonial moment after the merging of East Germany and West Germany, after that unification. And people who had the experience of being in East Germany felt at a kind of post-colonial disadvantage after the unification. They felt that there was an asymmetry in the country, that although formally, constitutionally, there was a kind of equality, in many ways, those in East Germany suffered from discrimination. They suffered from a discrimination because for many years they were outside of the international or cosmopolitan conversation on matters of culture, literature, theory. They felt that they had not had the same advantages, and therefore now in their new role as citizens of a unified Germany, they were treated with a certain kind of, let me put it, a certain kind of post-colonial arrogance shown against them. So that's an issue where I really saw this in practice, and I can speak for it. They began at it. This is the time at which Germany, much more than France, becomes a place where post-colonial thinking really emerges and it is institutionally adopted and strengthened. I've always felt that the Germans have been more interested in the post-colonial condition of the global South than many other European countries. Of course, England is the birthplace of many of these issues because its history is so related to Anglophone post-colonial thinking. But Germany, I have to say, through its own experiences of unification and inequality, asymmetry, also began to think of its own European condition through the mechanisms, through the concepts of post-colonial thinking and the experience of post-colonial societies. That's how I would address Sohan Mukherjee's question.
Yeah, I thought there was one more question that seems to be relevant now, because you talked about ethical interpretation, humanities as ethical interpretation. And here Ms. Marfi Alam is asking, with the coming of the pandemics, our human values themselves are reinterpreted. So how can you actually connect this human values getting reinterpreted, and based on that, how can we interpret humanistically the issue?
I think I've addressed this question quite fully earlier on. I would only be repeating myself. I think I've addressed this question. I'm skeptical of I'm skeptical about using terms like human values. You have to break it down. What are human values? Human values are creating conditions under which people can access benefits that they need. They can access their rights of free speech or their rights to health protection. They can access their various needs and interests. So when we talk about human values, we have to think about what we mean there. One of the great human values, if you want to put it, in the pandemic has been, for me, the sacrifice that people have made in order to give attention to their neighbors. This can either be sacrifice in a large professional and institutional way, where people have, as first responders, as doctors, as nurses, have actually put themselves in the way of danger, in the way of risk, to fulfill the highest ideals of their professions. These are people with families. These are people who have died. These are people who have caught the infection when they needn't have done it. But they've done it because of their ethical beliefs in their profession, and because they're taking their duty absolutely seriously and with great courage. So it seems to me that that is something that has been defined. But we can't so we have to think about human values in specific contexts. Just to make a demand, have human values changed? Yes and no. Human values are always changing, and human values are changing back again. Who knows after the pandemic whether there will be a new a time of profound narcissism and selfishness. People may have felt that they've been deprived of things. Maybe they will turn away from their neighbors and become much more self-obsessed. I don't know. But I think when we talk about human values, these questions have to be posed in terms of very specific issues. So first responders have done it. And as I said earlier, we have learned from the human values of those who have sacrificed themselves. This is not some universal principle. We have learned from the people who, most of them belonging to poorer class, migrant workers, day laborers, of essential workers in the United States, many of whom are Latinos, or Latinas, who themselves have, due to their own conditions of poverty, many comorbidities, ongoing diseases, diabetes, etc., because they have not been able to access the health system. They are the ones who have been keeping the society running. So, you know, the notion of human values is as much about survival and sustenance, whether you are a restaurant worker, whether you are delivering food to people, whether you're cleaning the streets. So I think when we talk about human values, we have to be specific. The question of transportation, which has been while we've all been quarantined, a lot of people have been, have had to be dealing with essential services. So transportation, driving a truck, attending to essential services, that is a human value.
Thank you. Ideally, everybody in the audience must be given some, time to interact, but that's not possible. Therefore, there are some, scholars who have agreed to interact with you. I think I would invite Professor Meenakshi Pillai from University of Kerala. Professor Meena, do you want to ask your question now?
Are you sure? Because there seems to be a lot of students. I think they should be given a chance.
Well, Meena, I've been looking at you and addressing my comments to you, and because you need an audience. So I've been looking at Professor and you looking at you. So please ask me a question.
I was thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking about how the pandemic has actually forced us to rethink our notion of boundaries.
Yes, very good idea.
So on one hand, the virus has turned out to be unmindful of borders, and has underscored a certain kind of an interconnectedness of the world. I'm not even speaking about it at a macro level, but also at the micro level. On the other hand, we also have various governmental responses to the pandemic, which has inevitably involved a certain kind of reinforcement of borders, not only at the national, the regional, but also at a far more micro levels, if I can call it that. So that is the first point, as a response to what you were saying. At another level, it has also underscored the notion of freedom, what it means to be free in a certain ethical and moral way. I think these are the two paradigm shifts that I thought we should be thinking about. Are you free to sneeze in public? How much of a certain kind of a rethinking does that entail? I was just thinking through these things, and these are I really would love to listen to your response to that.
So, my dear professor, in a good time, we would have been together. We would have had a nice dinner after this talk, and I love Kerala food. I travel in Kerala quite a lot sometimes, and I love the whole atmosphere. So I just wish that this question could have been, we could have had this discussion in person. But let me try and address the issue. This is a complicated issue. I did a program for the BBC Radio 3 maybe 2 months ago, where there were three of us. I think it's called Open Talk or Frank Talk, or I can't remember the title, something of that kind for BBC 3, where we took up some of these issues. I was in conversation with a French philosopher, and like in all good arguments, I disagreed with him and he disagreed with me. Now, I bring that up because his position was a very French position. His position was that we have done so much in the contemporary world for people in the domain not to be masked. I'm using this metaphorically, and not that we. So he feels that he felt. I hope I'm representing him correctly. That certain notions of civility, democratic interaction, shaking hands, hugging, these things were now governments, by imposing these sanitary public health regulations, were actually eroding those things, and eroding those practices through boundaries and social distancing was eroding our sense of freedom. Now, I have to say, I was a little short with him. He's a very good and eminent person, and I had to say, come on, get real. We are not suggesting that we roll this back so that, you know, for the rest of our lives, we move around with not shaking hands, not hugging, not giving each other the signs of hospitable greeting and generosity. We are dealing with an emergency at the moment. And that emergency requires some of these public restrictions. Yes, they are restrictions, of course. But I wanted to say at the same time that I don't see that in the long run, this will actually restrict our sense of freedom outside of the purposeful preventions of the pandemic. So that's a very practical answer to the question. Now, and I hope I'm tracking you correctly, Meena. I hope I'm tracking you correctly. If I'm not, please stop me. So now, as far as the French goes, and I think this is interesting, I think I was particularly a little bit strong in my comments. Because as you know, in France, they have made a major issue about the veiling of migrant Muslims. They have made this argument that in the French Republic, if you're in a public space, you cannot hide your face. So maybe I was unfair, but in his vociferous attack on masks, maybe I was unfair. I saw this kind of French libertarianism, you know, this French republicanism. Everybody has to be, you know, open-faced, and wearing a mask is somehow a precursor to veiling. And he didn't say this explicitly, but I felt it. And so I was actually quite harsh on this. Let me tell you something else, Meena. I remember discussing the question of veiling with one of the great inspirational figures in my life, one of the greatest writers of our time, in my view, Toni Morrison, with whom I taught at the University of Chicago. And when I got my job there, the president of the University of Chicago said, "What can I do for you?" And I said, "Let us make it possible for Toni Morrison, very unlikely, to come and go teach a course with me." And I had met her before when I was at Princeton. We got on very well. And to my honor, and she actually accepted. So we taught for 8 weeks together. And I remember a conversation on one occasion there. These were not the days of social distancing, so we used to go for drinks to the cafes quite often. And she said to me, now this is controversial, but I'm going to say it. She said, they make so much about, you know, how these Muslim cultures believe in hiding women's faces, etc. And she said to me, what about the American obsession with cosmetic surgery? Isn't it a kind of masking that as you grow older, chip, 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 all your wrinkles are taken away, your face is stretched so you look like a rubber band? I have nothing opposed to those who want to do it can do it. But I thought Toni's point was a very good one. She said, you know, some people do it for cosmetic reasons, for reasons of vanity. Some people believe, you may debate this, that there are religious reasons. No, but we are not in favor of imposing this on anybody. In a patriarchal culture, if a man says to his wife, you have to cover your face, I would object immediately, as would Tony. But this kind of Eurocentric way of thinking, that somehow somebody who can change the whole physiognomy of their face is not masking, and somebody who puts a cloth on it is masking, I thought was that. This is not relevant to your question, but I just thought I would throw that anecdote in, because many of these issues about what is social distancing outside of this current emergency, has other implications. So I would have to say, if somebody sneezed on me in public at this point, and I didn't have a mask and they didn't have I would be very angry. My freedom would have been fundamentally changed by my anxiety about what would happen to me. So on this one, Professor Meena Pillai, I think that if we want to think about how pandemic has changed the notion of freedom, then let me give you an example. I think that, and I've been doing a number, I've been doing a number of public events it started with something I did at Oxford and for the Jaipur Literary Festival on what I call unpreparedness, the governance of the unprepared. And I think if you want to ask me where I feel freedoms have been restricted by the pandemic, I feel one, as I said earlier, the real freedom to discuss scientific evidence and public health issues morally, ethically, and scientifically, and the way in which governments have restricted that. The second has been the governance of time, of unpreparedness, of keeping people in anxiety, being given 4 hours to de-densify Bombay, where migrant workers had to leave within 4 hours. Where are they to go? They sleep on the streets. They live in bastis. They live in jhopadpattis. Where are they to go? And yet being told within 4 hours, you have to leave. That small time of 4 hours is, I believe, a huge restriction of freedom. It's an abuse of people's freedom. The Chinese government keeping people for, a week or two without telling them about the pandemic in Wuhan. So people go around leading their lives without being told. Those 2 weeks, and those government things, those are where freedom has been really abused by our governments. Here in the United States, already, apparently, I have the figures somewhere, the actual dates, but it was like, 10 days. I think Fareed Zakaria said this on his show. It was 2 weeks between the president and his cabinet being told this is an emergency and the people being told about the lockdown. That is, although it was 2 weeks, that is a profound abuse of one's freedom as a citizen, one's freedom as a human being, that should be protected by the state, not exploited by the state. 4 hours to clear out a city and to go, which what the results were after that. What the people died, people had to walk for hundreds of miles, infecting each other, spreading. That's an abuse of freedom.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
So, can we invite one more person for a short interaction?
Yes, of course you can.
Professor T.T. Srikumar, are you there? Actually, he is, I think he has joined, and he is from FLU, Hyderabad. Professor T.T. Srikumar? Or even Dr. Vinod from NIT Trichy, he has also joined. Dr. Vinod, can you just come up?
Thank you, Thomas. Hello, Professor Homi Bhabha.
Hello, Vinod. Nice to see you. I've been looking, just like with Meena, I've been looking at you right through you've been my actual virtual but also physical audience. Thank you for being there. It's very difficult to just speak into nowhere. So thank
Yeah.
you for important points of contact.
Yeah, and I didn't want to be a distraction, so thank you anyway. My question is to do with the pandemic as a human condition and how it becomes a sufficient engagement in the humanities. But I would elaborate it because you have been trying to talk about what the humanities can do in the wake of the pandemic. Before I do that, I would say that your quick thoughts on theory are fabulous. And in fact, something that is an original takeaway for me is said that it has got this twin purpose of facilitating invention as well as renewal, which I thought is also the way perhaps the humanities should look at a human condition like the pandemic. Now, I thought we have been receiving the pandemic not the way the humanities would receive it, but through journalism. And I thought the first mediation or the major mediation or the most forceful mediation has been through journalism. And journalism has a trajectory which starts in observation because they have to report, but also has this undesirable quality of rushing to judgment. Now, the humanities obviously cannot afford that trajectory. It has to be a little more phenomenological, more nuanced. It can't rush to judgment. It should at best defer judgment so that the mediation can also become more an engagement with processes, the way we would want to process the pandemic. Now, I thought what is happening in the present situation is there is so much of a media ecology in which we are compelled, and even our thinking is compelled, that this processing of the condition is becoming a problem. Now, if that is the case, then how would the humanities be able to approach the pandemic as a human condition and as a way of engaging with such human situations?
So just so what is the problem? Is the problem that you feel journalism rushes to make a judgment? Is that basically the issue?
Now, the fact that journalism rushes to judgment and the fact that we are located in a media ecology makes us also, gives us templates, though we would not want to have them. It provides us enough templates of response that can be too distracting or interfere with the way the humanities would ideally want to approach the pandemic in terms of processing it, in terms of, having as many positions as possible and then enabling the conversation that you were talking about.
Thank you, Vinod, if I might call you by your first name. Thank you very much for that question. And I just want to refer you to something in an essay I wrote some time ago, which will reappear in the book that is coming out. I wrote on Edward Said after he died. I edited with a colleague of mine at Chicago. We edited an edition of Critical Inquiry. And I wrote a piece there called Adagio, which Professor Thomas mentioned. And if you look at Adagio, I talk about what I call the slow interpretation, the notion of slow interpretation. But Vinod, where are you now? I can't see you. Oh, there you are. Suddenly I can only see a huge big picture of myself, which I don't want to see, but anyway, there it is. So Vinod, I feel, good, that's nice. So Vinod, I feel that it is, we are asking for two things at the same time. I would be lost without the real-time journalistic experience. I would be lost, and many of us would be lost, because we are not out there in the field, if we don't get an immersive moment. Then we can step back as humanists or as philosophers or what. But I think that I give great credit to the best of the journalistic tradition. I don't give credit to the conspiracy theorists here. I don't personally give credit to many news channels here which are so steeped in one perspective that they precisely don't give us the fast changing situation because they only want one interpretation. This goes back to what I talked about as the ethics of interpretation. But it seems to me that I have learned a huge amount from these journalistic responses to real-time situations. And there are different speeds of interpretation, just as there are different speeds of comprehension. There are different speeds, just as when you make a photograph or you shoot a film, you shoot it with a different lens at different speeds. And I think that as long as we are aware of what a particular speed of comprehension or interpretation or description, as long as we are acutely aware of that speed and that frame, then I think we can take from the journalistic judgments what we need. You know, I think journalists, and now I'm talking about journalism as a very noble profession. You know, there are many ignoble ones, but I'm talking about it not simply, I'm talking about particularly something I find very impressive around the world, but specifically in India, is long form journalism. In Caravan magazine, in The Wire. I find I've done, you may know that I've recently done stuff on the American elections on The Wire. I don't know if you've seen that, but I did something just 3 weeks ago. But I'm a great admirer of long form or investigative journalism of a yes, I would say of a noble kind, because these people risk a lot. So I think that I'm a great admirer of that. In fact, I was for many years on the board of a major prize put up by a major Indian industrialist, and the categories for that prize were often history, literature, science, etc., or the humanities. And I said, look, in the humanities now in India, we have to include long-form journalism because it's beautifully done. Many of our long-form journalists are garlanded with prizes in all over the world, and we don't appreciate them. So let me say that I think as long as you know what the speed of the shot is and how the frame is being constructed, and that takes actually a humanistic education to understand that. So long as you know that, I think that the immersive experience is very important. Let me give you an example. And I've been continually here, every time I've made a theoretical point, I've tried to give you a concrete example for the audience. Let me give you a concrete example. For the thing I'm writing at the moment, as part of an introduction, long introduction to my book, I have been very impressed that following on the Black Lives protests, at least in the United States, a number of people from the humanities, be it journalists, academics, activists, artists, have referred to the protest as a moment. By talking about it as a moment, this is not merely a metaphor. They are thinking about a limited thing, something that has a limited time, right? Like the protest has a limited time. And they wanted to express the complexity of talking about big issues by looking at the limited moment, not simply collapsing that limited moment into a long history. If all we say, all we learn from the protests on George Floyd is that the American police system has a long history of criminal systemic racism and injustice, we've learned nothing. We've learned nothing about the phenomenology of why people came out of a lockdown with their masks on in the main, got to the streets, people of different generations, different races, and across the globe saying, we are not going to have this. They stood up to the moment. So when I'm reading, people keep referring to the moment, the moment, the moment. Now, I learn a lot from that. I absorb that vocabulary of the moment. Then I come to my desk where I'm now, and now I'm trying to write about the effect of short moments of time as part of understanding or framing events that have a long history. You see what I'm saying? The short moment of time. The 8.46 minutes of the video of whatever his name is, Police Constable Davin or Sergeant Davin with his knee on George Floyd's neck, that 8.46 minutes could quite easily be absorbed into a long history of racial killings by the police or racial violence. But I want to understand the effect of that short period of time in thinking about moments of traumatic political, moral, and social events. And you know what? Now that you talk about mediation, I'm trying to develop this concept of techno trauma. You know, how we receive that 8.46 minutes. It's part of a new technology of trauma. When I was growing up, I didn't have an iPhone where I could make a film and then watch it again and again and again. So I'm trying to develop this concept of what I call techno trauma. And let me tell you that when I was thinking about this, I started reading Freud again. And what does Freud say about trauma? He says trauma happens over a short period of time. But the task of trauma is not only repetition, my friend, but he says it has a task. One of its temporalities is repetition. So traumatic experiences, the experience of race, the experience of torture, keeps coming back again and again and again. But I'm now trying to interpret what he means by the task. Trauma is not only the repetition of the terrible moment of violence that absolutely restricts you, that shadows your life, that destroys your sense of imagination and selfhood. But it can also be a task of agency. It can be a task of subalternity. This is what I am working on this very moment, to use the word moment. And when I get off this wonderful Zoom experience, this is what I'm returning to. Why do short periods in public life have a certain affective potency that is traumatic and yet constructive? You know, in my work, I've always tried to argue counterintuitive arguments. Things that people don't think go together have always been my particular speciality, which is why I drive myself mad and I drive my readers mad, because I'm always trying to do that. So I apologize. But you know, that's the way I was wired. Does that come to some of your issues, Vinod?
Oh yeah, it does. It does. In fact, I wanted some clarity on where the humanities stands with respect to.
Right. So I think the immersive is quite important.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I cannot but repeat what you taught us today about the need for alterity, democracy, and community development. So let us invite somebody in the audience. So in the true spirit of democracy, let's open it to because there are around 1,000 people on Zoom now.
Right.
Somebody can now unmute and ask, representing the whole audience.
Professor Joe, can I make one request?
Sure.
After we shut this down formally, I would like to just have a little discussion. So yourself, if Vinod doesn't mind hanging on, if Meena doesn't mind hanging on, or whoever, 2 or 3 people, if we can just sort of have a little conversation, it would be nice as a way to, for me personally, so to speak, off the air, but just between ourselves. If you have a little time to spare, it would be nice to be able to.
Yeah, he will be there.
Perfect.
So now it's open. The floor is open for anyone to unmute and ask one question.
ஈஸ்வரத்தை பிடிக்காது அந்த விஷயம் தான். ஒரு இடத்துல ஒரு காசு என்ன மட்டும் தான் நான் சாப்பிடுவேன் அப்படின்னு நினைச்சேன். அந்த அடி
Yeah. Anyone? Dr. Biju is there, or Dr. Johnson? So anyone can now represent the unrepresented here, the unspoken. So please, we have little time for that.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Hello.
Yes.
Good
You are
evening.
audible. Yes.
Sir, we read in history.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes. Can you please introduce that person? I would know you.
Yes, okay. I'm Sambhaji Narude from Maharashtra, India.
Let's go ahead.
Hello. Okay. Sir, I have a very innocent and very simple question. In this pandemic, don't you think that all the science laboratories and research laboratories are failed because they are not proper using such a authentic vaccination to the common people or to the everyone? So please comment on this question that all the science laboratories and research laboratories are failed to provide a proper vaccination.
All right.
Please unmute the speaker.
Yeah. Jaren, Professor Jaren, please unmute Professor Bhabha. Yes. Hello.
Myself, and I don't know. Have I been muted all this time? No.
I think so. You got muted.
But you didn't hear me when I said, can we get
Yeah,
together?
that we heard.
Okay. I don't know why I suddenly I was muted. But Sambhaji, I don't think I agree with you. With due respect, I have to say that the laboratories had to work very, very fast. I've looked into this issue, and initially there was very little understanding of what COVID-19 was. According to now, I know nothing about this. I'm not a scientist, but I'm talking both about research scientists and historians of science. So that there's a real issue about what it was. So to produce a vaccine in this amount of time, in this short time, is absolutely remarkable. And now, of course, we will have to wait and see how effective it is. But usually vaccines, like a flu vaccine, from my understanding of it, is 68 to 70% protective. According to these vaccines, from what I read, the figures are 93, 94% success rate, which is very, very unusual. So I don't see it from your point of view. I think that they have done a very good job. Where I think there will be a problem, and there is a public health problem, is in the distribution of the vaccine. Certainly in America, we are beginning to see major issues about the distribution. So I think the issue really to focus now is not in terms of the common people or the mass of the people, is not on the quality of the vaccine, but on the governmental policies that determine the distribution of the vaccine. That's the issue. And that's also a very difficult, to think about that humanistically, to think about that ethically is a complicated issue. Yesterday, my wife, who's in the School of Public Health at Harvard, was listening to a program. I only listened to a part of it, by one of the finest minds around this pandemic problem. And he was saying it's not easy to decide who should be given the vaccine first. Should it be old people who are isolated very often in the United States, unlike in India? Old people don't live at home. They're not looked after. They're in old people's homes. Should it be given to doctors and first responders first? Should it be given to, communities where there are many comorbidities? To be poorer people, often happen to be people of color. So I'm just saying to you that that the distribution aspect is complicated by inept governments, but also the moral and political, social issues are complicated ones. Sambaji, I hope I have answered your question. Please unmute and tell me. Sambaji is silent. Anyway.
I think someone else has asked for a chance. So, is anyone?
Yes. Good evening,
Yeah.
sir. I hope my voice is audible.
Yes.
Yes, are you Somnath?
I have a question. Yes, sir. So my question is, in the beginning, you talked about the minority protests regarding killing of George Floyd and linking it with the subsequent pandemic. So my question is, what will be the situation post-pandemic? There will be still minorities, there will still be situations, and the world has experienced it. The entire world psyche has experienced this phenomenon.
Yeah.
So what changes can we expect to see in the future? And also, sir, a sub question to this: what is the future of pandemic literature, keeping in mind the COVID-19 situation?
Sorry, can I ask you, what is pandemic literature? What do you mean by that?
Sir, literature related to say pandemics, means novels which have dealt with future pandemics.
Yeah,
Or
well, how
say
can I tell you that, my dear friend? I mean, I don't know who. I mean, there are a lot of people who are writing for pandemic novels, pandemic essays. I mean, it's all over the place. So the future of it, I don't know. I mean, I think the future of the plague has created huge amounts of literature. Think about cholera. Think about Thomas Mann's Death in Venice. In fact, I was pleased. I was surprised that one of the early Parsi novels I read somewhere was written about the epidemic in India, the epidemic in India, the typhus, etc. So I don't know about that. Now your other question, your previous question, is a very serious one. You know, what will people learn from this? Again, I can't answer. I think that certainly there are some structural changes as I see them in the United States taking place. There is a real rethinking of the police force. You know, how, the phrase defund the police is not the appropriate phrase. I think it's a misspoken phrase, but the idea behind it is right. Police reform, police training. When you are called out to a community because somebody is on the street behaving crazily, maybe they have a psychiatric problem. Maybe they're not dangerous. Maybe what you need in a police force is to have access to psychiatrists when you go on the street to make an arrest. So I think certainly in the state, people are thinking about police. There is, according to what I read this morning in the Biden administration, there has been a new committee set up to talk about public health distribution of facilities. And it's being led by an African-American woman from Chicago, I think, who said this morning that this is an opportunity being given to us by the Biden government to really try and make public health equality universal in this country. Whether this works or not, we don't know. But I am saying, for instance, again, what we've seen in the past few days in terms of the politics of white supremacist protest, they will impeach Trump or they will not. I mean, all that is an open question at the moment as to what will happen to him, whether they will evoke the 25th Amendment saying that he's not capable of running the country. All that is open. But what is interesting is that many of the major businesses, Goldman Sachs, Marriott Hotels, have now decided that they are not going to give political donations to Republicans who contested the results of the election. So it's very difficult to tell. And soothsayer, I can't tell you what's going to happen in the future, but I can certainly say that in this country, there are attempts to deal with this issue now. Whether that actually builds into anything over a long period of time, we will tell when I give the 35th Sheppard Memorial Lecture, which I'm only joking, of course, but I'm just saying in the future we can get together and discuss it.
Yes. Can I bring something very quickly to your notice?
Yes, please, because I have something else in about 7 minutes. I have to get to something very important, because I would just like to meet a few people for 2 or 3 minutes and say thank you at the end. Yeah.
Okay, then fine. Then
so would you like to ask me now if it's something very quick? But
it was just a trend that is coming up in India. I was reading today that IIM Calicut is trying to start a course with management and literature, management and humanities. So is it good or bad? I mean, I'm saying management.
Well, it all depends. I'll be very quick here because I really have to get off to another thing, but I'll be very quick. I mean, if literature is simply treated as the as the kind of handmaiden of management, just to give examples. If you read Dickens, you can see these passages about poverty. If you read X, you can see these passages about slavery. It all depends. If you read these Dalit poets, you will understand what castelessness does. I mean, it all depends on how this relationship is articulated. If it's if literature is merely wagging the tail, and management is the lion roaring ahead, that's not, in my view, that's not the right humanistic situation. Okay, my dear friends, I would love to just speak to 2 or 3 people just to say thank you at the end.
Yeah, but Kiran, can you just say a few words of gratitude? Yes.
Please.
Hello, Jaren.
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are. Yes, go ahead.
Honorable Chief Guest of the webinar, teachers, research scholars, and participants from all over the world. Words of gratitude to the distinguished speaker of the day, Professor Homi Bhabha. We are overwhelmed and enlightened with your academic expertise and your genuine interest in disseminating your...
Terence, you've been muted.
You got... Jaren, you got muted, please. Yeah, go ahead. Jaren?
Oh, I don't know. Somebody else muted me.
Yeah.
Fine.
Go ahead.
So, Professor Homi Bhabha, we are really...
Jaren, you are again muted.
What's happening?
Hello?
Yeah, you are audible now. Go ahead.
So, Professor Bhabha, we are really enlightened with your academic interest and expertise in disseminating your scholarship, which I truly believe would enhance the realm of knowledge. And this lecture, I believe, has been a perfect tribute to Professor C.A. Sheppard. And on behalf of the Department of English at St. Berchmans College and all the participants, I convey our deep sense of gratitude for this insightful session. I thank Professor P.J. Thomas, head of the department, and all my colleagues for the unwavering support in exploring the possibility of online platform in conducting this memorial lecture with a world-renowned academician as the keynote speaker. I also acknowledge the roles and responsibilities everyone partook. Reverend Josh Jacob, Professor Anishka Joseph, Professor Nitin Verghese, Professor Amal Toms, and our student volunteers, Dan, Nina, and Tojo, and all other people who worked behind the scene in making this memorial lecture remarkable. I thank everyone whose contribution has helped in making this program a resound success. Thank you.
Yes.